Hello everyone, welcome back, and today we're going to continue our exploration of the ideas, the concepts of pollination and fertilization. And in addition to this, we're going to talk about what happens to the seed once it's been formed. Okay, some of the things that can happen to seeds once they're formed. All right, so let's begin. Okay, so pollination is just simply the mixing of the male DNA from the male part of the plant with the female DNA of the female part of the plant, and joining those together and making a seed. Okay, and that seed then grows into a new plant, generally speaking. Now, so the male DNA stored in the pollen. The pollen is on top of the stamen. The stamen, you can see here in this flower, is made up of the filament, which is the stalk, and the anther, which is at the top, and the ovule or the egg is stored inside the carpel. Now the carpel is the female part of the plant, and that's made up of the ovule, or the ovule, sorry, the style, and the stigma. The stigma is at the top, and the stigma is sticky. Okay, so the pollen has to move from the anther on the stamen to the stigma of the carpel. Now, quite often you'll hear the carpel referred to as the pistil as well, particularly in North America. I'll mix and match them because I sometimes forget, but so we're looking at the carpel or the pistil as the female part of the plant. Here we see a graphical representation of pollination and fertilization. It starts with the pollen on the male part of the plant. Now, this can be transferred by insect or other animals. It can be moved from one to another. It can also be transferred by wind, or it can fall off by gravity. So we'll look at some of the ways in which that's possible. But the pollen has to get from here to the stigma where a pollen tube forms. And we've looked at this before, and the pollen tube grows down into the ovary where we find the ovule. And that ovule is another word for ovule is egg, and the DNA joins to forming a seed. Okay, so pollen from the anther on the stamen to the stigma, pollen tube grows down, joins with the ovary, fertilization occurs, and the seed is formed. Okay, so flowers come in such a wide variety of sizes and shapes and colors and smells and ways in which they try to attract the pollinators, ways in which they're formed in order to best utilize the wind to transfer the pollen. So we'll just take a look at some of these. So here we see this is a bee orchid, and of course if you look very closely at this orchid, it looks like a female bee. Okay, and then you get the March marigolds, where these flowers are wide open. They're bright yellow, orangey yellow, and that's very attractive to insects. Now, what's curious about this is the insects see with a different sort of light spectrum than what humans see with. So they'll see something slightly different. There'll be patterns hidden in here, which if you used ultraviolet light, you would be able to see. You got the sweet vernal grass. You see these long, stocky flowers. And of course, the honeysuckle. The honeysuckle is a tremendously sweet nectar hidden inside these plants that are very attractive to both birds and insects. Okay, so here we see an example of a British hazel plant. Now, this hazel plant has both male and female flowers. So you can see the female flower just over here with the bright red stigmas sticking out of the top. And these long sort of flowers here, these are the male flowers, and they're called catkins, and this is where all the pollen is stored. Now, the beauty of this is because they're so long and they're just hanging as the wind blows, it picks up the pollen and it can transfer it over to the stigma. Okay. These are long and dangly, as it says here. Now, the key with these is because it's relying on the wind and not an insect, it has to release a tremendous amount of pollen in order to ensure that the pollen gets to the stigma. Okay. Okay. You can see here in this image, if you look at the powder here, this is the wind, and the wind is shaking the plant, and all of that pollen has been released, and you see there's a tremendous amount of it. And I'm sure that most of you have been out and you've shaken a tree and you've seen the pollen sort of blow away. It's pretty cool. Okay, so here we see yet another example of a wind-pollinated plant. You can see these here are the catkins, the long dangly stalks here, which have all the pollen. And as the pollen blows off, you see it's difficult to see, but you see these little sort of hairy, feathery like objects. These are the stigma of the female parts of the plant, and the pollen blows by and it sticks to here, and then the pollen tubes grow and fertilization occurs. Okay. So now this here is a flower. This is a butterfly orchid, and it requires insects to ensure that pollination occurs. And you see the insect will fly in here, usually a butterfly with a very long sort of mouth part or proboscis. And that proboscis sort of moves down and it drinks the nectar at the very bottom of this tube. And in doing so, you can see that the anthers are here, and the pollen then gets placed on top of the butterfly, and then as it flies to another flower, it transfers that pollen to the stigma of another flower. It's quite impressive the way that works. And the flowers are designed to attract the butterfly that it requires to do its pollination. There are so many insects that feed on pollen, but perhaps the most important is the honeybee. And we all know about the honeybee, but it's really perhaps agriculturally, from our perspective of the food that we eat, perhaps the most important insect on the planet. And we need to make sure that we consider, the effect of our behavior on the survival of the honeybee. So as insects travel from flower to flower, pollen gets stuck all over its body. And as it moves, there's a very good chance that the pollen, you can see it here, all these little sort of yellow dots on the surface of the bee's body here. There's a very good chance that as it's moving around, you can see the stigma here, that pollen can get stuck onto the stigma of a new flower, a new plant. So over the next few slides, we're going to have a look at how the flower of the foxglove plant has been adapted to promote or attract sort of pollinating insects. All right, so let's have a look here. So you can see there's a bee going into the foxglove, and the foxgloves are these long tubular-like flowers, right? And it's just big enough for a bumblebee to fit inside. So we see a cross section of a flower just here, the foxglove flower, and you can see it's a long tube. And as this bee squeezes up the tunnel here, as it squeezes up the tunnel, its back rubs against the stigma, okay, and the stamen or the anther and the filament of the flower, and it collects pollen here, and it can deposit the pollen here, or in the next flower it can deposit the pollen there. Now you see these little hairs here. These hairs are designed to keep smaller insects from crawling in, because the flower doesn't want those insects in there. It just wants the bumblebees, which it's going to use for pollination. The evening primrose uses color to attract the moths in the evening. These bright yellow petals are easily seen at dusk, and it has these sticky chains of pollen here, which then attach themselves to the moth, and they get transferred from flower to flower. Now this is perhaps my favorite type of flower. This is what we'd call a snapdragon. In particular, this one we call broom here in Scotland. Now, it's designed to be pollinated by heavy insects like bees. Now, the male and female parts of the plant are contained here inside the keel. This is a keel, and you'll see that these petals form what we call wings. Okay, and this bit here, this hood, is designed to attract the larger insect, the bee. And as they fly in, they land on the wings, and then snap, this keel explodes open. And when it explodes open, it exposes the anther and the filament and the stigma and the style and the ovary. It exposes all of that. And as you can see here, here's one that actually has been snapped open. And then it covers the insect with pollen as it does so. Okay, for those flowers that are pollinated by insects, most of them are large and very brightly colored. The reason for this, it's so that insects can find them more easily. If they are small, if the flowers are small, like in the case of this dandelion, you see that there are loads of them all mixed together. Okay, there are tons of them, and you can see, just if you're looking at the pointer here, you've got the stigma and the style and the ovule here, the ovary, and then the anther and the filament here, and there's loads of them each from an individual flower. Okay. All right. Now, here's a question. Can you think of why we don't see very many red wildflowers in Britain? Why there aren't that very many red wildflowers in Britain? Think about that for a minute, and then we'll go on to the next slide. Well, if you said because they can't see it very well, you're absolutely right. Insects don't see the color red very well. It's because of where it is on the visible light spectrum. It's at one end, which insects don't see very well at, and as we move through the visible light spectrum, we get over insects see much better over here. Now, that being said, insects don't see red very well, but birds do, which is why we do have some flowers which are red in color. Another reason for the red in color is to tell organisms or plants not to eat it because there's some toxicity in there. Okay, so we've recapped pollination and fertilization. We've had another look at that, and we've looked at ways in which pollination can occur. And now we're going to talk about what happens once a seed is formed. How does a seed get from the fruiting flower to the ground so that it can grow again? This is something called seed dispersal. Try that again, seed dispersal. And that basically answers the question, what happens to a seed once it has been formed? So let's have a